And the main telecon session concluded with Bob Lund, who was our Vice President of Engineering, presenting his conclusions and recommendations charts, which were based on our data input up to that point. Listeners on the telecon were not pleased with the conclusions and the recommendations.
What was the conclusion?
The conclusions were that we should not fly outside of our database, which was 53 degrees. Those were the conclusions. And we were quite pleased because we knew in advance, having participated in the preparation, what the conclusions were, and we felt very comfortable with that.
Presented that conclusion?
Mr. Bob Lund.
Right.
He had prepared those charts. He had input from other people, but he had actually physically prepared the charts, and he prepared them.
The Marshall Space Flight Center guys all effectively told Beaujolais and company to go screw themselves. George Hardy, Marshall's Deputy Director of Science and Engineering, said he was appalled by Thiokol's decision not to launch, and Chief of Solid Rocket Boosters Program, Lawrence Malloy, disputed Thiokol's findings.
Mr. Hardy from Marshall was asked what he thought about the MTI recommendation, and he said he was appalled at the MTI decision. Mr. Hardy was also asked about launching, and he said no, not if the contractor recommended not launching. He would not go against the contractor and launch. There was a short discussion that ensued about temperature not being a discriminator between SRM 15 and 22, and shortly after, Mr. Kilminster was asked by NASA if he would launch, and he said no, because the engineering recommendation was not to launch. Then the MTI management then asked for a 5-minute caucus. I'm not sure exactly who asked for that, but it was asked in such a manner that I remember it was asked for a 5-minute caucus, which we put on the line on mute and went offline with the rest of the net.
At the time that you made the recommendation, Thiokol made the recommendation not to launch, was that unanimous recommendation as far as you knew?
Yes, I've got to make something clear. I have been distressed by the things that have been appearing in the paper and things that have been said in general, and there was never one positive pro-launch statement ever made by anybody.
Thank you.
There have been some feelings since then that folks have expressed that they would support the decision, but there was not one positive statement for launch ever made in that room. Picking up where the caucus started.
Just to give you, is that your recollection too, Mr. Thompson?
Yes, particularly in the caucus. I think Roger and I were the only only people that expressed our views.
But no, you should proceed with the launch at that time.
Not amongst the people that I was able to hear.
Eventually, the 3 Thiokol managers who attended the teleconference were pressured by Marshall into agreeing for a go to launch. Beaujolais and fellow engineer Arnold Thompson begged them to change their minds, reminding them of the damaged O-rings from Discovery's near-fatal 51C mission, but their efforts were in vain.
Look out! Look out!
Those of us who are opposed to the launch continue to speak out, and I'm specifically speaking of Mr. Thompson and myself because, in my recollection, he and I were the only ones that vigorously continued to oppose the launch. And we were attempting to go back and re-review and try to make clear what we were trying to get across, and we couldn't understand why it was going to be reversed. So we spoke out and tried to explain once again the effects in low temperature. Arnie actually got up from his position, which was down the table, walked up the table, put a quad pad down in front of the table, in front of the management folks, and tried to sketch out once again what his concern was with the joint. And when he realized he wasn't getting through, he just stopped. I tried one more time with the photos. I grabbed the photos and I went up and discussed the photos once again and tried to make the point that it was my opinion from actual observations that temperature was indeed a discriminator, and we should not ignore the physical evidence that we had observed. And again, I brought up the point that SRM-15 had a 110-degree arc of black grease, while SRM-22 had a relatively different amount, which was less and wasn't quite as black. I also stopped when it was apparent that I couldn't get anybody to listen.
At this point, did anyone else speak up in favor of the launch, or?
No, sir. No, sir. No one said anything. To my recollection, nobody said a word. It was then being discussed amongst the management folks. After Arnie and I had our last say, Mr. Mason said, "We have to make a management decision." He turned to Bob Blunt and asked him to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. From this point on, management formulated the points to base their decision on. There was never one comment in favor, as I've said, of launching by any engineer or other non-management person in the room before or after the caucus. I was not even asked to participate in giving any input to the final decision charts. Went back on the net with the final charts, or final chart, which was the rationale for launching, and that was presented by Mr. Kilminster. It was a handwritten on a notepad, and he read from that notepad. I did not agree with some of the statements that were being made to support the decision. I was never asked nor polled, and it was clearly a management decision from that point. I must emphasize, I had my say, and I never take any management right to take the input of an engineer and then make a decision based on that input. And I truly believe that. I've worked at a lot of companies, and that's been done from time to time, and I truly believe that. So there was no point in me doing anything any further than I had already attempted to do. I did not see the final version of the chart until the next day. I just heard it read. I left the room feeling badly defeated, but I felt I really did all I could to stop the launch. I felt, personally, that management was under a lot of pressure to launch, and that they made a very tough decision, but I didn't agree with it. One of my colleagues that was in the meeting summed it up best. This was a meeting where the determination was to launch, and it was up to us to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was not safe to do so. This is in total reverse to what the position usually is in a pre-flight conversation or a flight readiness review. It's usually exactly opposite that.
Astrobrand responded with this.
Okay, you believe NASA murdered the Challenger crew. Your evidence is that they ignored warnings. The mission had already been postponed 2 or 3 times. It was a risk. They decided to go. There was no reason to believe that if the O-rings failed, it would be catastrophic.
First, Astrobrand is clearly exaggerating about the postponement. Challenger was originally scheduled to launch on January 22nd. It launched on January 28, and the deadline to launch was April.